This is Luke Broyles with 21st Century Finance, and today I want to answer a question of what is Bitcoin's inflation rate. This is a question that people don't normally ask at first. However, as soon as you start learning about inflation, monetary debasement, you begin to compare Bitcoin versus other sorts of currencies, fiat currencies, the US dollar, and eventually the inflation rate of Bitcoin. That question tends to come up for people. So before we can even answer that question, we have to cover two things first. First, we have to cover what really is inflation here. What most people define as inflation is a general increase in rising prices over time. However, this isn't entirely correct if you have the Austrian view of economics, as I do, which is instead the inflation rate is actually the expansion of the monetary supply and not the rise of prices in themselves. And I don't have time to get into why that is here, but basically, when you have prices that fluctuate either up or down over time, there are a wide variety of reasons. That could be with demand, that could be with supply, but instead, the inflation rate itself is the change in the supply of the denominator of prices, aka the money in which those commodities are priced in. So what makes inflation on a proof of work system, that's POW here, different from, say, inflation on a fiat system, which is akin to the US dollar? What makes these two systems different? And the answer to that is that when it comes to Bitcoin, which is the dominant proof of work protocol in the world, what you have here is a group of computers that have consensus on what the inflation rate of the system is. It's outside the control of human beings, it's predetermined, and in Bitcoin's case, it is fixed, versus in case of fiat or the US dollar, it is dependent on what is most convenient politically, economically, or for other reasons. It's basically you have a computationally based system relying on verification versus a human emotion-based system relying on fiduciary trust. And so now that we have an accurate definition of what inflation is and what makes these two systems different, which these are much longer topics we don't have time to get into, we can then answer the question, what is Bitcoin's, aka the dominant proof of work protocol? What's the inflation of this system? Now, when it comes to Bitcoin, Bitcoin is produced through creation of new blocks by miners. Miners expend energy, and they are rewarded with more Bitcoins for their mining of the network. This is a much more complicated topic we don't have time to get into, but essentially what you need to understand is that new blocks on the Bitcoin blockchain, or otherwise known as time chain, are produced about every 10 minutes or so, roughly speaking, and every 10 minutes these rewards are given to the miners, and the supply issuance for these rewards is cut in half every 4 years. You'll soon hear about the halvening if you haven't already for Bitcoin in the Bitcoin space, and this is what that's referring to, that every 4 years the supply of Bitcoin gets cut in half. And again, to refer back earlier, that's not a coincidence. That's not something that's chosen at random. That's something that has been designed from the start, that every 4 years the supply is cut in half, which makes the inflation rate cut in half every 4 years. So if we take a look at the math, and I encourage you not to be too overwhelmed by this, this is the entire monetary supply of Bitcoin here, this middle section here. If you were to try to calculate the monetary supply of any other currency, whether it be Ethereum or another cryptocurrency like that, or if you were going to try to calculate the supply of the US dollar, good luck. It's going to be much more complicated than this simple little equation here. So if we go step by step, we see here at step one, the total amount of available Bitcoin will be the sum, aka over here on the left. And then number two, the amount of Bitcoin mined in each block, 50 Bitcoin mined per block every 10 minutes in the first epoch. And having every 4 years, down here at step three, every 210,000 blocks, which is roughly 4 years. 210,000 blocks, one block every 10 minutes is roughly 4 years. And this amount gets cut in half from an initial amount of 50 Bitcoins. I'm very fortunate and blessed. I actually know people that were around in this era, and it's quite amazing to think that they could just be running a very cheap laptop by today's standards and getting 50 or being in the pool of at least for 50 Bitcoins, that was a block reward. It's absolutely mind-blowing that's how recent and how recently Bitcoin's value has appreciated in the last 13 years or so. And so through a geometric progression, n is the nth halving event, so say 2 to the 1st or 2 to the 5th or 2 to the 20th here, you can basically calculate how many bitcoins will be issued in that specific epoch, which is every 4 years. And basically you come out to this final number over here of 20,999,999.9769 bitcoins ever to be created. Now this is often rounded up to 21 million, for obvious reasons. But basically, this is exactly the number of bitcoins that can ever exist on the Bitcoin protocol. And so it blocks 6.9 million, 33 epochs, aka 33 halvenings, into Bitcoin's development. All the bitcoins will have been mined. And so that is the entire issuance supply of Bitcoin. But most people don't care about this. Most people will never be able to articulate this or understand it. So all we need to do is think of this in a visual representation instead. So on here, over here on the y-axis, we have the total number of bitcoins down here from 0 at the very bottom all the way up to 21 million here at the top, and down here on the x-axis we have the block height. We have the block reward halving event in these little blue squares, and then the supply is in red here. And so what we have is this, again, geometric progression here of this red line that becomes increasingly flat as a function of time. And even though it appears flat for the vast majority of this time here, where you can see my cursor, it actually is not flat. It is continuing to halve every 4 years, which you can see by this blue line, or these series of blue lines over here. Every 4 years, this is halving again and again and again, 33 times, all the way out to the year 2140 over here. And where are we today? Well, I'm filming this video in 2022, towards the end of 2022. And so what you have here is we're over here at the very, very beginning of this flat period and the very end of this hyperinflationary period of Bitcoin's supply. The vast majority of Bitcoin's inflation is behind us, and the vast majority of Bitcoin's issuance stability is ahead of us. So anyway, I won't read all this for you. You can read that for yourself. And so one way to visualize this, these little blue lines, these epochs, is to look at a Bitcoin issuance graphic here. This is created by the creator on Twitter called Wicked Smart Bitcoin. He's a pseudonymous Bitcoin content creator. I highly recommend you check out his work. He has very interesting graphics such as this one, and I really think this is one to set in the true exponential nature of issuance halving every 4 years. Exponential trends and factors are very difficult for humans to be able to comprehend because we have linear thinking. I've referred this to a previous video, and I will continue to refer to it because it's one of the most important things when it comes to Bitcoin, to understand that this is an exponential piece of technology, and human brains have a very hard time wrapping their head around it. So again, I give full credit to this, what we're about to watch here to Wicked Smart Bitcoin. And even though this is roughly 2 minutes long, I encourage you to watch the whole thing to be able to appreciate the true scarcity of what's going on here. So, and I'll pause it here to explain. I love the music too. This is today. I just stopped where we are today in the year 2022 and the fourth epoch, and already over 90% of all the Bitcoins have been mined. Okay, and in this time period, the price of Bitcoin has gone from roughly 6 cents all the way up to an all-time high of roughly $70,000. Yes, it's crashed recently, but keep in mind, we're only in the fourth epoch. Now let's watch the rest of this to appreciate the true scale and absurd magnitude of absolute scarcity. I simply love that, and that you can visually see just how incredibly scarce Bitcoin is and how many Bitcoins have already been mined. It's absolutely mind-boggling to me. So, and this is just one of the many ways that you can visualize it. So, if we're going to go here to the next slide, I'm having trouble. Give me 1 second. There we go. So the long answer short for this entire video is that Bitcoin's current inflation rate in 2022 is at 1.8% annually. That's how much new Bitcoin supply is being added to the network every single year in 2024, the next halving, the beginning of the next epoch, the fifth epoch. That will be halved again to roughly 0.9% annually, again and again, all the way until we reach 0% in 2140. Now, to compare that to something that most of us are more used to, aka the US dollar, its current inflation rate is more like 12 to 15% today. I know the official number out there is roughly 7 to 9% for the majority of 2022, but this is false, simply because, number one, the majority of people define inflation in the incorrect way. Again, most people define it as a general increase of prices, and yes, even though it's a textbook definition that you'll learn, it's not really the accurate one. This is something that has been changed in history to fit the narrative of central banks and help us ignore the debasement of the dollar. So it's more roughly 12 to 15%, depending on who you ask. However, this is rapidly decreasing as the Federal Reserve continues quantitative tightening. And so nobody really knows what the inflation rate of the dollar is. While Bitcoin's inflation rate, I can tell you exactly what it is, down to the single Satoshi all the way out for the rest of time. I can tell you what it is in 20 years, in 40 years, in 80 years, in 120 years, and even 1,000 years from today, well after 2140. I can tell you exactly what its inflation rate is when nobody can even tell you what the dollar's inflation rate is today. Now, this is higher than it has been historically. Typically, it's been more roughly 5 to 9%. Again, depending on who you ask, nobody really knows. But that's generally what most Austrian economics folks and Bitcoiners like myself believe it to be. And this will only get more dramatic as a function of time as the U.S. continues down the debt spiral that we currently are in, even though it will take many years and perhaps a decade or two for this to become even more apparent. It will only get worse. So if we're going to compare the issuance from Bitcoin to the U.S. dollar real quick, this is a graphic that I've created for an upcoming film that I'm working on explaining Bitcoin and the importance and significance of Bitcoin for every single individual, and so I'll be talking about that more in future videos. But for now, this is a visual to help explain the disparity between debasement of the US dollar as well as Bitcoin. So we can see this orange line here between 2009, with Bitcoin's launch, to 2022 today. We can see the hyperinflation of Bitcoin's supply, and we see in the white line the issuance of the US dollar. We can see the previous 107 years of the US dollar, as well as the stimulus from lockdowns. And if we're going to go out to 2045 here, just to keep up with the unfunded liabilities of the U.S. government, the dollar already is becoming vastly dwarfed by the incoming supply of cash. And as we can see here in this text, that less than 0.03% of all U.S. dollars exist today if they survive all the way out to 2140. Versus Bitcoin, where today in 2022, over 91% of them are already in circulation, and it's not going to increase. And so what we have here is we have an expanding infinite supply of U.S. dollars, as well as every other fiat currency in the world. Every single price today in U.S. dollars is going to get dwarfed by prices in 10, 20 years, and those prices get dwarfed from 20 years from then, on and on until infinity. And yeah, the dollar may surprise. This is not predicting hyperinflation of the U.S. dollar, even though that's a strong possibility. This is simply projecting our current liabilities and our current rate of spending and easing that we have out into the future. This is not projecting any sort of global catastrophe, any sort of world war, or any other event that would require higher rates of inflation, higher rates of monetary debasement in the U.S. dollar. And so what you have here in this final image is the common saying of infinity divided by 21 million. You'll hear Bitcoiners talk about this very frequently, about how there's an infinite amount of cash, an infinite amount of energy, an infinite amount of assets that humans are able to create, to decree, and to innovate and discover in terms of energy and assets divided by 21 million bitcoins, there will only be 21 million bitcoins now in 100 years, in 1,000 years, and that's what that means, and hopefully that's starting to set in just how dramatic that is. But it gets even more dramatic because even though most people have heard that there are 21 million Bitcoin, there's actually far, far less because millions of Bitcoin have either been lost back from when they were just cents or dollars. They were very frequently lost. People lost their passphrases and their keys to their coins, and a large number have been bought by whales and entities. And so roughly today it is generally held as a estimate in many Bitcoiners' minds that there's roughly 13.5 million Bitcoin available. This is able to be validated due to the pseudonymous nature of Bitcoin, and we're basically able to tell that there's roughly 13.5 million Bitcoin available that have not been lost or stolen or destroyed, and virtually for all intents and purposes destroyed. And of those 13.5 million, roughly 3 million of them are left to be bought or mined. As I'm recording this video, just over 2 million are left on exchanges available to be bought, and there's roughly 2 million left to be mined. And so if we're able to calculate that, there's roughly 3 million left, and there's roughly a million disparity there simply because we don't know how many of the Bitcoins on exchanges are claimed versus not. These are all just IOUs. But if we basically take just general assumptions here, there's not 21 million, there's more, probably like 3 million. But if we meet somewhere in the middle and assume that 100% of the available Bitcoins will be traded on the market, it's still very absurd. And so if we take this 3 million number of Bitcoins and divide it by the average person, roughly on an average basis per person, we're looking at roughly 0.000375 Bitcoins per person. And at the time of filming this video, that's about $7.50 in US dollars. And most people will cringe at what I just said. If you're watching this in the future, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, or 50 years from today, this will probably incite a lot of pain. And so I'm sorry, I'm not trying to offend you, but it's just the reality that you could have bought this much Bitcoin at the time of filming this video for $7.50, which is minimum wage here in the United States. So it is remarkable that for every single hour you can earn a lifetime's worth of Bitcoin for the average person when Bitcoin becomes a world reserve currency of Earth. It is simply mind-bending math we're looking at here. And this is not my chart, although I have a very similar one like it that is basically projecting how many Bitcoins average per person. And so, as you can see, again, the estimate of 13.5 million up here, and as we go from 0 people all the way out to 7.5 billion people, however today it's more like 8 billion people, we go from roughly 100,000 Bitcoin owned per entity all the way down over here to barely 40 to 50,000 Satoshis, which are the underlying units of Bitcoin. And so, as we can see, just by projecting these very conservative numbers of wealth distribution based on the Pareto principle, we can see just unbelievable scarcity, and it is very, very early. And this is not to mention people that are not individuals, but instead companies, nations. There are hundreds of nations that are all going to want and need Bitcoin because it is a weapon of war, and there are going to be millions, tens of millions, perhaps even hundreds of millions of companies that will need Bitcoin in very short order here, as it is a form of digital energy. Energy companies need Bitcoin, other forms of companies need Bitcoin, and eventually when everyone's using Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, all companies will need Bitcoin. And no other asset in human history is this finite. Not gold, not energy, not cash, not stocks, bonds, even real estate. Yes, all these things have different degrees of scarcity. For example, gold is a far superior store of value than, say, cash, because gold is far more scarce than cash when cash is infinite, and gold is infinite. It's infinite on a far, far longer time horizon. We will be able to mine as much gold as we desire, whether it's from the earth or from outer space or in some other means. We'll find a way to get more gold if society needs more gold. However, it takes an extremely long period to create more gold, whereas cash can just be issued by a decree. Likewise with stocks and bonds, these things can be created out of thin air, and real estate as well. Even though houses are difficult to create and it's very difficult to find or discover or create new land, it's possible to create more houses as a function of time. And the difference between a finite asset and a scarce asset It cannot be overstated. And one of the best explanations of this is from Michael Saylor, who's a very prominent Bitcoiner. You might have heard of him if you're watching this video. And so I encourage you to listen to this little speech he has on this very topic of scarcity versus finite assets.
Every other asset on earth, anything else you can own, houses, gold, silver, commodities, stocks, bonds, when the price goes up, the supply increases. If I increase the price of any stock by a factor of 10, the company issues more stock.
Of course.
If I buy all the bonds, all the municipal bonds, the price of bonds go up, people issue more bonds. Right? If I drive up the price of gold by a factor of 10, people print more gold or mine more gold. Bitcoin's the only thing in the world that's inelastic to price. If the price of Bitcoin triples, you can't make any more. If the price goes up by a factor of a million, you can't make any more. Now, so Tucker, let me just give you one more engineering insight. In engineering, there's something called conservation of energy.
Yes.
And the whole point of conservation of energy is energy can either be made or destroyed. There has to be conservation of it. The mathematical metaphor, the mathematical analogy to that is proper math. 10 plus 10 equals 20. 2 plus 2 equals 4. If 10 plus 10 ever starts equaling 18, you got a problem.
Yeah.
If you have a bathtub and there's a leak, if you have a swimming pool with a leak, if I have an electric system with a short circuit, if I have a leak in my engineering system, nothing works. Nothing in the world of ocean engineering, aeronautical engineering, electrical engineering, nothing works lest you respect conservation of energy. The problem with inflation is inflation does not respect conservation of energy. I've got a leak in the system. I've designed a currency which is not conservative. So properly understood, if you said, I want a conservative money supply, a conservative money supply would be there's $10 billion in the economy and nobody prints anymore.
Right.
And that's the Austrian economic sound money principle. Bitcoin is a conservative monetary system. It's the first system that respects the laws of thermodynamics and the laws of physics and the laws of math, which means it is true and pure, right? It has integrity. If you have...
I just love that. That's a very profound to think about. It's a little mind-bending at first, but I encourage you to think about it more, replay or watch the full interview that he has here with Tucker Carlson. Saylor has many, many dozens of hours of excellent speeches on the subject, but what he's saying here is basically that this is the first of its kind in human history, and that everything else we've been able to create or mine or print or discover, we've been able to make more of. And Bitcoin is an emergent decentralized protocol verified by a network of thousands of computers across the world that validate each other and that they aren't going to be able to create anymore. And this is what makes Bitcoin, aka digital proof of work system, unique to everything else. And so my encouragement to you is that it doesn't matter how much you buy. All that matters is that you understand what you're buying. This video is by no means a comprehensive explanation of Bitcoin, of how we know Bitcoin is secure, how we know there will only be 21 million. This is simply answering what that inflation rate is. So I encourage you first and foremost to understand what you're buying. And then once you understand what you're buying, you understand where to store it. Don't keep it on an exchange. Don't keep it somewhere where it could be hacked or stolen or otherwise lost to you. So understand what you're buying, understand how to keep it for the long term, because this is a very long-term asset. In 1,000 years, it is going to be far more valuable than it is today, almost certainly. And so third, I encourage you to regulate your emotions and focus on the fundamental question. Bitcoin inherently is very volatile. The reason it is so volatile is precisely because supply is so unbelievably scarce and so unbelievably finite that it is incredibly responsive to demand shifts. And so I encourage you to regulate your emotions, because when demand tapers even slightly, it will crash by by a matter of 20 to 50 to 70, 80%. And when demand increases ever so slightly, it will go up by a factor of 300%, 500%, 1,000% in price, perhaps even more in the future if we ever see major nations enter a hyperinflationary period. So my encouragement is, it doesn't matter if you're buying $100,000 worth of Bitcoin, $1,000, or even $7.50 worth, or even $1. Get off zero, buy some Bitcoin, know how to store it, and keep it safe. And so my encouragement to you, even if you think this sounds ludicrous, is this: is the price of a cup of coffee worth securing exposure to the likely replacement of the US dollar in the event of hyperinflation? None of us want this to happen. Bitcoiners don't want this to happen. Nobody wants to see this occur. However, the more us Bitcoiners learn about Bitcoin and the nature of this thermodynamically sound system, it only becomes more and more likely, in my mind personally, that this is the inevitable result of the US dollar. The United States has experienced hyperinflation before, and I believe that there is an increasing probability that we will. Granted, the United States, of all the nations in the world, is perhaps the least likely to experience that, and perhaps the last one to experience that. However, it is such a compelling case for Bitcoin and a horrible case for the US dollar that it seems that this is possible. And so even if you think there's a 1%, 5% chance that this is going to happen, is it not worth $7.50 to just buy some Bitcoin, keep it aside, just in case the crazy Bitcoiners are right? And my warning is that the vast majority of humanity will not adapt to new technology, in this case Bitcoin, until the final moment when panic ensues and everyone is scared and trying to figure out everything at once. And so I encourage you, don't wait until the average person starts thinking about exponential technology and exponential printing of money and exponential debasement of currency. I encourage you to be smart, think different, and to get off zero as quickly as possible and understand what you are buying and hold on to it and never sell.